Hello, and welcome to Gun Violence in Missouri, Seeking Solutions, presented by the Kansas City Star in partnership with American Public Square at Jewell. My name is Denisha Snell, and I'm the Director of Programs for American Public Square at Jewell. In the past few months, the Kansas City Star reporters have interviewed citizens, activists, faith leaders, and survivors of gun violence as part of the Missouri Gun Violence Project. This project was undertaken in partnership with the nonprofits Report for America and Missouri Foundation for Health. Today, we've assembled a group of panelists who are dedicated to improving outcomes for Missourians by improving the neighborhoods in which we live. Experts state built environments, or the places we live, is one of the determinants of health that will help us understand why some communities experience higher levels of gun violence than others. Reframing violence as a public health issue is vital to the health of our communities and a framework for change. The neighborhoods in which people live have a major impact on their health and well-being, and each of our guests works diligently to support healthy communities by addressing at least one social determinant. The goal of today's event is to engage community members and work together to understand long-term solutions to reducing violent crime throughout the lens of social determinants of health. We will have a civil, fact-based discussion exploring how we can move Missouri forward. As part of American Public Square and Kansas City Star programming, we welcome questions and fact checks from the audience. Please comment on the live stream with your questions or requested fact checks. Ian Cummings, editor with the Kansas City Star, will serve as today's fact checker. You can also find a fact sheet to support today's conversation on our website, americanpublicsquare.org. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Humira Lodi, reporter for the Kansas City Star. Humira.
Thank you, Denisha. Through the Missouri Gun Violence Project, the Star is taking a novel approach to examining gun violence by exploring its many forms, understanding root causes, and identifying effective solutions. Our latest series explores how gun violence is impacted by and impacts a community's social determinants of health. Those quality of life conditions include having stable and secure housing, accessing good food, attending quality schools, and growing up in racially segregated or economically depressed neighborhoods, what researchers call the social determinants of health. Today, we are examining built environments and how this affects gun violence in communities. Both St. Louis and Kansas City are blighted with acres of abandoned properties, owned publicly and privately. Data shows gun violence follows the vacancy from neighborhood to neighborhood without fail. Public health researchers have shown that the built environment of a community, including vacant lots and abandoned buildings, has an impact on the risk of gun violence. It is part of an overall picture of well-being in a neighborhood that includes factors such as income, housing, food insecurity, and education. Studies show cleaning up and maintaining neighborhoods can reduce crimes. To begin our discussion today, I would like to introduce our panelists. Please welcome Laura Ginn, strategist with the St. Louis Development Corporation. Our next panelist is Sunday Whiteside, board president for the St. Louis Association of Community Organizations. And finally, we have Aaron Royals, Neighborhood Outreach and Research Coordinator at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Center for Neighborhoods. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. We are examining the gun violence issues that plague Missouri and how our built environment or our neighborhoods play a part in the health of a community. I want to start by giving each of you the opportunity to tell us about yourself and your respective organizations. Let's start with you, Erin.
Hi, so as Humira said, I'm with UMKC Center for Neighborhoods, where I'm the Neighborhood Outreach and Research Coordinator. And there I do a lot of work with community folks and neighborhood leaders. I also do a lot of meeting watching and meeting attendance. So I'm very active in attending city hall meetings and neighborhood meetings. And I also do a pretty big amount of research. So the latest project that we just wrapped up was a housing study of small apartment buildings in the Central City Economic Development Tax Area, which basically coincides with the Prospect Corridor on the east side of Kansas City. So thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for being here, Erin. We're excited to have you. Laura, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Laura again. I'm the vacancy strategist for the city of St. Louis, which sounds very broad, I'm sure, to most people. So the way I interpret that is that I work across departments and agencies and within communities to address vacant and abandoned properties in St. Louis. And that includes working to remove the health and economic racial disparities that vacancy and disinvestment have caused and continue to perpetuate in our neighborhoods. So in the day-to-day, that includes things like working to convert concentrations of vacant properties to new community green spaces like orchards or parks, but it also involves demolishing vacant buildings and working to improve our demo practices, surveying properties and trying to do tree removals and overgrowth and issues that attract illegal dumping, and working with communities to promote equitable reinvestment in whatever way that may mean to our different neighborhoods. I do this work for St. Louis Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit, but it functions as the city's economic development agency. And we're an umbrella organization under which lies many more. And I say this because I think it's really relevant to vacant properties and the built environment that we'll talk about today. And so under SLDC are things like our Port Authority, our development incentives, but also something called the Land Reutilization Authority. And the LRA is our city's land bank. 2021 is actually our 50th year, and we're the oldest state-created land bank in the country. It means we're the owner of last resort. So when a property is foreclosed on and it goes to a sheriff's tax sale, if no one bids on that property, it falls into our ownership, and then we're responsible for caring for it until some other type of investment comes along. We own about 11,000 vacant properties in the city, but that's only 40% of all of the vacancy and abandonment that we are facing. The other 60% are owned by private individuals. So that can be, a person or an entity or a speculating corporation. And so each of those properties has a unique story and a unique challenge. And we try to work within both those land bank, but also the much broader issue. And just to point out the concentration of vacancy in St. Louis, and I'm sure Sunday will talk about this more, is that the majority of our vacant abandoned properties are concentrated in our communities of color. And so in St. Louis, that means North St. Louis. We're known infamously for our Del Mar divide. And so if we look at it that way, north of Del Mar, about 30% of all parcels are vacant and abandoned. And south of Del Mar, it's only 3%. So this is an issue that disproportionately affects our Black and Brown St. Louisans, and is caused by racist acts of governments and predatory lending, all of the things that I'm sure we'll get into today. And because this is such a broad and complicated issue, we know we can't fix it alone. And so we've started something in St. Louis, largely thanks to Sunday Whiteside, and I'll stop talking here in a second so she can explain more, of something called the Vacancy Collaborative. And it's not an actual entity, but a collection of everybody from academia to neighborhood associations and residents to city departments that convene around 6 working groups and a work plan that we continue to try to make progress collectively towards reducing this issue in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And with that, I want to turn it over to Sunday to talk a little bit about the work that she's doing in her organization as well.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Laura, for giving me a good plug-in so I can talk about certain things. So my name is Sunday Whiteside, and I'm board president of the St. Louis Association of Community Organizations, better known as SLACO. And for over 40 years, SLACO has been addressing a broad range of issues that strengthen neighborhoods and empower neighborhood residents to have their voice so that they can improve the quality of life for themselves. So some of the programs that we sponsor are our Neighborhoods United for Change program, where we have united highly segregated St. Louis. Our neighborhoods are really divided. Our city is really divided by what is called, as Laura had mentioned, the Del Mar divide. So you see a contrast of living conditions as you drive really down one street and that would maybe be like Kings Highway, and you cross over Delmar and you see how lives from north and south are different. What had happened was a lot of our southern neighborhood residents would come north to see how we're living here on the north side and be astonished and almost appalled at our living conditions. So SLACO established the Neighborhoods United for Change. It's a program where we take an 8-hour day, really, maybe 6 hours, and we bring a neighborhood group from North St. Louis together with a neighborhood from South St. Louis. We meet initially, have conversations about living environments, what they look like in our different areas, what a vision of togetherness could look like, and then we load them on buses and they go out and they tour each other's neighborhoods. So we take them all to the South St. Louis neighborhood, and then we take them to the North St. Louis neighborhood. And they look at various aspects of the neighborhood, from the assets to some of the problem areas, to some of the great residents that exist in some of our historic communities. And then we bring them back for a dialogue, almost a debriefing on what they have experienced. And it ranges from sheer astonishment, shock, to people feeling inspired to work together to dismantle some of the racial stigmatism and systematic racism that exists in St. Louis, so that we can all have a better quality of life and work together. The other thing that SLACO focuses on is youth development. So we have an Emerging Leaders Youth Program where we hire youth during the summer to get involved in neighborhood associations and community work, and help us with our cleanup campaigns called Keep It Clean, where we inspire neighborhood residents to have a love and care for their neighborhood and keep their neighborhoods clean. Clean is essential right now, because as we drive around our neighborhoods, they are just abandoned buildings, trash is everywhere. On our roads, on our highway entrances and exits, you will find trash. And people have just a disregard where they think that the city is responsible for picking up the trash. So you'll sit at a stoplight and you'll see someone taking a bag of food that they just ate, like from White Castles or fast food, and just throw it out their car window, roll up the window, thinking that that is the city's responsibility. We want to change the mindset of residents, and we want to encourage them to keep the area clean. So Keep It Clean, KICK, is one of the campaigns that some of our youth help run and help us work with neighborhoods to host cleanup events. And a lot of our neighborhoods are composed of seniors and elderly, and they need that youthful help to perform the cleanup. We also had our youth host a mayoral debate when we had a competition for a new mayor, and we have our first African-American female mayor. Our youth gave one of the best debates, one of the most peaceful and forward-thinking debates that were hosted in our city. So we're very proud of our youth development programming. We also try to build the capacity of all of the neighborhood associations throughout the St. Louis region and in East St. Louis. We have Precinct 12 that's a member of SLACO as well. But we offer trainings and classes on building neighborhood capacity for each neighborhood organization. We also host a yearly neighborhoods conference, a regional neighborhoods conference. And so please save the date of September 18th. We will be hosting the regional neighborhoods conference again, and this time it will be in person. Keep our fingers crossed and say some prayers, but we hope to have that in person. But the last thing that we do is our advocacy work. And in 2015, SLACO selected vacancy as its #1 advocacy issue. So we founded a vacancy committee, and we created several great programs such as the Finest 15 and the Prop NS petition-driven $40 million bond issue, which is something that came out of SLACO's vacancy committee. But one of our greatest achievements, in addition to all of those things, is the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative. And it is a collaborative of a platform, really, for different stakeholders that are all wanting to learn about, share priorities, and work together to eradicate vacant properties in our cities. The thing about this Vacancy Collaborative is that it is community driven. So even though we are now over 50 organizations, over 12 city departments, and hundreds of volunteers that work together to make these things happen, we have a lot of community input. And every month, our 6 working groups are allowed to, they have monthly meetings about different topics. So we have a vacancy prevention working group, a displacement working group, a stabilization, maintenance, and demolition working group, a reinvestment and reuse working group. And all of our working groups work together to bring civilians, residents. I'm an everyday resident. I live in the Walnut Park East neighborhood. And even though I notice how typical business is done in St. Louis, where we normally create task force and collaboratives that have invitation representation. So even though you may have a neighborhood organization there, it is only their leader. And there is limited opportunity for the everyday resident to be able to show up, have a voice, understand what's going on. But with this structure of the Vacancy Collaborative, every time we host our meetings, a civilian resident is allowed to participate, to co-chair, to hear what's going on, to have ideas. And we've created an 18-month work plan on eradicating vacancy that the collaborative will use, because we have such a large group of people working together. It was difficult to coordinate them and make sure some of our working groups are not stepping and duplicating some of the efforts of a different working group. So we created a work plan, an 18-month work plan that we are revitalizing now, because I think we're on our 3rd year of the plan. But residents are allowed to give input, and we just really work strategically to try to be the umbrella for all vacancy efforts in the city of St. Louis. And I'm going to end my talking here, but thank you for allowing us to be on your program and express some of the things that we have, the work that we have going on in our city.
Thank you, Cindy. And finally, I wanted to take a moment to introduce John McDonald. He is our final panelist and a professor of criminology at the University of Pennsylvania. So John, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing.
Sure. Thank you for letting me join this conversation. John McDonald, professor of criminology, and I study how the built environment affects our health and safety. A lot of the work that I've been doing for the last 15 years with colleagues in epidemiology and emergency medicine has been thinking more strategically about how we can change places to reduce crime and violence in neighborhoods, as well as improve both physical health as well as mental health of residents. Actually, kind of a plug for a book that I wrote, co-wrote. It's called Changing Places. It's about how we can use science to design safer and healthier communities, and highlight some of that work. So some of the work I've done, for example, in Philadelphia, in collaboration with community-based organizations like the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, has looked at the role of vacant lot greening, greening vacant lots, how that can help reduce crime, as well as violence, as well as mental and physical health in the community, looking at the role of abandoned houses and how remediating them can help reduce violence. For example, we have one study where we find that you can get as much as a 29% reduction in gun assaults by making sure that houses are up to basic code, have working windows and doors on them. And I'm at the point now where I've been doing this research long enough. I'm convinced of the findings, and I think that we should be doing more interventions about places in communities, especially communities that have suffered from multiple generations of disinvestment, physical infrastructure falling apart. I think that when we're thinking about health and safety, in particular gun violence, we should be thinking a lot more about the role of the physical environment and the role that plays, not just the aesthetic role, but the actual role it plays in shaping safety in neighborhoods. And so the opportunity to think about and discuss the great work that people in this panel are engaged in, that should be happening, more of it in St. Louis, Kansas City, Youngstown, Ohio, Milwaukee, all across the country. We have a neglected physical infrastructure, and especially in poor communities, and we should be focused, I think, a lot more about how investing in those communities and piloting interventions with community-based groups can be used to reduce the problems that communities are experiencing, in particular, the problems of chronic concentrated gun violence. So look forward to discussing more and answering any questions.
Thank you, John. And thank you to all our panelists again for being here. As I'm sure viewers can see, we have panelists who are very involved and experienced in this work, and I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say about this. And I think all of you touched on the idea of disinvestment, so I wanted to start there. And Erin, we know that disinvestment in certain neighborhoods is not new. Can you talk a little bit about the history of how certain Missouri neighborhoods have gotten to this place?
Yes, so I'll mention a few sort of things that kind of got us to where we are. And so I'll start with talking about redlining. I think it's a topic that people are talking about more and more. There's been some really great books and pieces that have been put out recently that I think have kind of brought it to the fore. But redlining as a practice, if you've heard about it, is nothing new, right? So starting back in the 1930s, we see the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a government entity. They produced these maps, right? And so with these maps, there's about over 200 of them produced, but these maps cover cities all across the country. And we see that cities are color coded based on risk, right? But these maps were not just risk when it comes to like financial investment, but the risk was really kind of codifying the racial makeup of these neighborhoods. And so you can pull them up online. They're really fascinating, and they do quite a lot to kind of explain why certain neighborhoods that were deemed risky investments are still kind of in like a disinvested state today. So these neighborhoods were color coded from A to D. A was green on the map and reflected neighborhoods that were newer construction, but also neighborhoods that were predominantly white. And then all the way down to D, which was red on the map, but these were neighborhoods that were older housing stock, but also predominantly Black. And so a neighborhood that might be rated as D on these redlining maps would have a hard time, if not just straight up impossible, getting any kind of lending or financing from a bank. And so we can kind of trace this back to the 30s, where we have, government kind of backed government codifying of these lending practices. And we know in this country, well, not just this country, but this world, but when we start to do things a certain way, it's kind of hard to stop doing them that way. So redlining as a practice is technically illegal. But in the work that I've been doing at the center, and even some of my other work, you talk to folks on the ground and they will tell you all these stories about how it's really tough for them to get loans from the bank, or if they do get loans, they're subprime loans, or they're these loans that have not great kind of terms. They might be balloon loans or adjusted rate loans, even if they are actually qualified to receive prime loans that have better rates and better terms. So this practice of redlining, this practice of kind of keeping lending out of certain neighborhoods is something that, though it started historically kind of a long time ago, is still imprinted on the map in the spaces that we interact with day to day. So start with that one. Around the same time, we see World War II starting and the effort ramping up to support World War II. When the vets came back, that's where we see this housing boom construction. So suburbanization, though it kind of started some decades before, really ramps up in the 40s going into the 50s. So we see development happening outside of cities in spaces that maybe were cornfields or just otherwise undeveloped. And those houses and the loans for those houses were only available to white folks. And so we see again how Black people and other people of color are kind of shuttered out of lending and out of the housing market. And with the suburbanization that took place at that time, we see the rise of the interstate system. And so the damage that the interstate system, or some people think that it's positive, but if if you talk to our neighborhoods now that are dealing with gun violence and other types of disinvestment, they'll tell you these stories about how the highways came to their neighborhood and just decimated them, kind of destroyed them. So being that I'm here in Kansas City, the best example of this is 71 Highway. It's a very convenient connector of downtown in South Kansas City, but the neighborhoods that it tore through and that, kind of got destroyed through the construction were predominantly Black neighborhoods. If you talk to older folks, they'll tell you about how these neighborhoods were thriving pre-71 Highway. And when the highway came for convenience and for development that was happening in more suburban areas, there was kind of a price to pay. So the neighborhoods that had 71 Highway pass through have never really recovered. And if you map these areas, you'll see that the areas along 71 Highway have extremely high vacancy, higher vacancy than even areas, not near 71 Highway. So, obviously there's a connection there between the construction of the highway and the vacancy that it produced. Then fast forward a few decades and we start to see what the literature calls reverse redlining or greenlining. And so it's these neighborhoods that had historically had really tough times getting lending or getting any kind of financing are now being bombarded and targeted with loans, often unsolicited. So something I didn't mention in my introduction is that I'm a PhD candidate in geography at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And so as a geographer, I'm really concerned about place and space, how the space around us is shaped and the processes that go into shaping that space. And so when it comes to something like greenlining, to me, it's extra insidious because these are the same neighborhoods that were denied lending for a long time. And now they're being targeted with these loans like seemingly out of nowhere. So we see Black folks and other folks of color who struggled for decades not being able to get lending, not being able to get mortgages, all of a sudden having these money just kind of handed to them on a platter. And so a lot of folks did take that money. And as you might expect, the terms and the principles of these loans were not great. People found themselves underwater quickly, and then they lost their homes. So we see this dispossession that happens directly kind of related to the redlining that started and was codified in the 1930s. And then the final thing I'll say kind of process-wise is demolition. So a number of other panelists have kind of brought up demolition as something that has really physically impacted the neighborhoods that are now experiencing high rates of gun violence. And with the work that I've been doing at the center with the CCED area, we've seen, I was able to pull 20 years of building permit data. And the most common building permit for the CCED area is a demolition permit. Over the past 20 years, there's been very little construction in the way of small apartment buildings. And so we classify those as apartment buildings between 2 and 19 units. So those apartment buildings aren't being constructed. Instead, they're being demolished. This is problematic for a number of reasons, but we know not just in Kansas City and St. Louis, but nationwide, these apartment buildings make up the core of the affordable housing. So when you tear down those apartment buildings, you're limiting the availability of affordable housing, but you're also reducing the supply of housing, period, which means that the price for every other kind of housing, whether it's single family or larger apartment buildings, goes up. So these sort of things that I just kind of went through really quickly, they've all kind of contributed to the vacancy and the violence that we see in these neighborhoods that we're talking about. And I mean, if I could just sum it up quickly, I'd say systemic racism. I know people are kind of rolling their eyes or, why does everything have to be about race? But, these Hulk maps, the redlining, all of these processes are directly tied to racist lending practices and segregation.
Thank you so much, Erin. I learned so much from that. And I just wanted to clarify, can you explain what CCED stands for, what area that is?
Yes, so the CCED is the Central City Economic Development Tax Area. It was passed a few years ago by Kansas City voters. The whole entire city voted on this. And there is a 1/8 cent sales tax, and that's what funds the CCED. And so that's about $10 million a year over the course of 10 years. And this money goes into a pot. There's a board that manages the fund, and it's targeted along the Prospect Corridor. So that largely coincides with 9th Street on the north, Gregory on the south, Paseo on the west, and Indiana on the east.
Thank you. Professor McDonald, we understand the role that public health plays in our response to things like pandemics. But can you tell us, in your view, what role does public health play in addressing gun violence?
Yeah, well, I think ideally public health, the role that public health would play would be thinking about gun violence more the way we think about things like infectious diseases. So looking at mapping where the concentration of gun violence is occurring, how it spreads across social networks, and then thinking systematically about what can be done to try to reduce it. So does that involve some of the things that we've discussed, like reinvesting in neighborhoods, making sure that abandoned houses are up to code, cleaning up vacant lot, making a less attractive place for outdoor drug market to occur, which then brings potential disputes between drug dealers. You could thinking about kind of the whole neighborhood and what would. So to me, a public health approach would be very much focused on thinking about place and how people experience health within those places. So that's kind of the ideal public health response, and engaging community groups in that work. But historically, public health departments in the United States have focused mostly on enforcing, ordinance around restaurants, basic kind of zoning around health issues, and violence hasn't been kind of a central part of public health agencies, although there's a lot more discussion about that now. Right now, I would say a lot of it is more of an academic discussion, and with some policy makers talking about it. But I think, ideally, cities and counties would have public health agencies thinking more strategically about chronic violence, especially if you just think about lives lost as well as morbidity, so people injured. Gun violence is, a leading cause of death, especially in disadvantaged communities. And the average age of somebody shot is somewhere in the early to mid 20s in most places. So they're talking about not just people being killed, but also the long-term effects of that for those individuals as well as their families. So I think it's got, ideally it'd become more part of the response to violence, would be a public health response of the nature that I just mentioned.
Now that we sort of understand the issues that the community is facing, I wanted to talk for us to talk a little bit about how this is all related to gun violence. Laura, do you see a correlation between economic disadvantage, physical environment, and crime?
Yes, I'm sure we all see it. I think the if I can pivot a little bit, the challenge is not recognizing it. It's finding a way to reinvest in the appropriate ways. I think what Erin said about once we build something, it's really hard to unbuild it, right? Once we create a system, we kind of operate within that system. And so even as we know that disinvested communities are facing crime, but also violent gun crime more than other communities that don't have those decades and generations of disinvestment, there isn't agreement on what to do about that. And there's a general sense that just putting more money isn't necessarily the answer, because you're feeding it into the same machine that doesn't know how to spend that money well, right? So From my day-to-day perspective, though, the main thing I kind of think about is that we are signaling as a city that the rules don't apply here. So when you're walking about on a high vacancy block, for example, and you have several lots that are as high as my shoulders or even above my head sometimes, or you have a tree that's fallen onto the back of a vacant building and has been sitting there for so long, there's another tree growing up out of the building, right? The signal to everyone that can see that is that the rules do not apply here. You need to make your own rules. And I think we extrapolate that to our sense of safety and what we can expect our government to be providing for us or not, right? And that's more of that kind of that connection, I think, that we make when we see that around us every day.
Thank you, Laura. And Cindy, I know that you're very involved in working with community leaders throughout St. Louis. And I had a two-part question, but I wanted to start by asking, can you talk to us a little bit about what are community leaders' concerns about blight or vacancies in St. Louis?
I think we have a lot of concerns, but one of our number one concerns and what we notice is, and I agree with what Dr. Royals, I'm gonna go ahead and claim it, has stated, is that systemic racism is at the root of it. But what has really happened in some of our neighborhoods, and community leaders will agree with this, is our family structure in the African-American home has been completely decimated, wiped out, essentially. And we have systemic racism, social norms, and the media that are all playing a role to help unseat and take out some of our family structures. African-American males, they have been a target. They almost have a target on their back from childhood, that at a young age, they are either demonized or criminalized, and some placed in the penal system. So we have that happening, which has taken some of the root and the strength out of our homes. Single parent mothers, I'm a single parent mother myself. We carry the full brunt, but it gets harder, increasingly difficult to do so when society targets our young sons, our young males. So we have that happening. So the family structure has been annihilated. And then you top that off with some of the limited opportunities. We've had reduced, denied, and just total eliminated opportunities. And we need to have opportunities at every level, at childhood, at adolescent, and at the young adult level. We have to consciously and intentionally create these opportunities and pathways for children to experience new things and have activities. We also have to create them for our adolescents so that they can start career thinking. We normally in our society, we think of college, high school, college, and then a career. That is not for everyone. So we have to have a multitude of pathways and opportunities for our young people. And I think in adulthood, we also have to have mechanisms so that if they should fall through the cracks, we have a way to help them stay in our society. I just think as a community and all of our community leaders, we are focused on that whole wraparound approach to dealing with some of the things related to the family, the housing situation, the vacancy problem, and the problem with violence. And one of the critical things is our youth. There's an African proverb that says, the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Essentially, that is what we have happening in our communities because our family structure has been decimated. Some of our mothers and some of the parents that are still working hard have been neglecting their children. There are no longer resources to help them sustain the family and the household, and our children have been neglected and traumatized. When they see some of the violent acts perpetrated in our communities, they then go out feeling traumatized and are more prone to repeat it and develop it as a way of life. We have to fundamentally get back to some of those things that helped us create family. Filling those vacant properties, those vacant lands, rebuilding our community is where we have to start going. And it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen. And all community leaders, especially in St. Louis, and I'm quite sure Kansas City, understand that the root of solving our vacancy problem is definitely in brick and mortar, but it's also in building back families, building back our people, and focusing and investing in our youth and giving them opportunities at every stage of their life.
Thank you, Cindy. And I know you mentioned earlier also sort of the idea of working with people to help them understand the importance of these things, of clean environments. And I just wanted to ask, can you talk a little bit about how exactly do you work with community members and leaders to understand how the violence can be curbed in relation to built environments?
I'm actually I'm on a steering committee for a new program that really links this violence to health, and it's called Cure Violence. And it is in my neighborhood and 2 other neighborhoods in St. Louis, I believe Wells Goodfellow and Dutchtown neighborhood. And in my neighborhood, I think they have done a drastic thing they have these violent interrupters. They come into the neighborhood and talk to the youth involved in some of these. And I think that is really the key, really embracing people. And it's going to take a certain level of discomfort for all of us. But we all have to start having conversations together, whether you're a CEO, a neighborhood leader, or you're one of the young Thundercats out on the street. We have to embrace each other if we want to rebuild our community. So that is how we really reach them. We start talking to them, bringing them into the fold. And that is one of the main reasons why I introduced youth into SLACO's programming, because every neighborhood group needs to have a youth component, a youth group voicing their concerns. We have become detached, and as I stated earlier, we have neglected our children, and we have to start there by bringing our young people on board with not only just the cleanup piece, but the community engagement piece. Here's how we build community. Here's how we work together. We have to bring some of those young Thundercats. I used to call them thugs. I can't do that. They don't like that. They don't like it, so I'm going to call them Thundercats. But it is hard. It's a horrible feeling to know some of these young 14 and 16-year-olds and go outside my house and they say, "Hi, Miss Sunday," and I say hello. But when I look at their Facebook page, I'm alarmed because they are carrying an assault weapon or posing with guns, literally. And our households are so demolished. Sometimes the grandmothers that have reared these children or the young single mothers do not feel empowered, like they have the authority to say, "Take that down. What is wrong with you?" In some of our households, we've become frightened of our children. And so we've got to gain back that authority and bring them into the fold to let them understand that this is not appropriate behavior on any level. But really, it's about community engagement. I want to make them a part of our SLACO Neighborhoods Conference. I once thought I wanted to have a thug conference, but as I stated, I'm not calling them thugs. They're my young Thundercats. But we need a conference bringing together all of our youth, the OGs, and the young G's. We got to bring all of them together and start being a little bit uncomfortable having these conversations with the people that are really perpetrating some of the violence in our neighborhoods. And if we don't bring them to the table, we're not solving anything. So every conversation we have about violence as it relates to youth toting guns or whatever, we need to make sure we have them at the table.
Thank you, Cindy. Before I move on, I wanted to see if anybody had anything they wanted to add as well before I move on to the next section.
It looks like John is talking.
I think he's on mute.
Oh, yeah. John, are you muted? You may be having a few audio issues. All right. So our next section will be about policy and citywide efforts. And Laura, can you tell us a little bit about the work that is being done by the Community Land Trust?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So one of the challenges that we face, and I kind of mentioned it in my intro, is a lack of ownership and authority of this built environment, right? So we have about 10, 11,000 properties sitting vacant and abandoned that are owned by the city's land bank. But that is, again, an owner of last resort. It was created just to be kind of a sanctuary for those parcels no one else wanted for a temporary amount of time. And then we have this hodgepodge of all kinds of different owners that can live out of state, out of country, could be passed away and just no one even knows it yet, right? And so there's no authority or autonomy in the community to be able to move those properties from their current condition into another, disregarding, everything Aaron said about how difficult it is to even get funding and to get appropriate and equitable funding opportunities. But just getting that land use power is, to me, an essential part of the steps here. And so what the idea behind community land trusts is intentional ownership of properties at a community or neighborhood scale, in which the decisions made about what happens for those particular properties and land use and decisions are made by the most local group of residents as you can. Adds a more hyper-local level of democracy around these land use decisions. And so what we're launching right now is a land trust that will be comprised of a board and representation of the residents where these properties are, hopefully primarily staffed from these neighborhoods too. And we're launching it with a $1 million challenge grant from the Missouri Department of Conservation, which is actually our state fish and wildlife agency. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that, but they understand the importance of access to nature in your own community for all Missourians and all children, right? And so their emphasis is helping to get to the point where that access to safe outdoor natural spaces is an equal opportunity experience. And so that first endowment coming from our State Department is a challenge to others, particularly in health and in housing, to start to meet that match and get this effort moving forward. So it's a little in the beginning stages, but it's also 5 years in the works and well overdue. So we're excited to see where we can move that. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Laura. Professor McDonald, I want to ask, people may not automatically think of neighborhoods when they think of criminologists. So I just wanted to ask, as a criminologist, why the study of neighborhoods, and in particular, how can housing policy, help reduce gun violence?
Sure. So turns out that criminologists have been studying patterns of crime for over 100 years now. And one of the things that's notable, even going back to the 1800s, is recognition that serious crime tends to cluster and tends to be correlated with features of communities like concentrated poverty, in this country, segregation and poverty combined, and particularly also the demographics in terms of age. So places with poverty, young individuals, especially young men. We've known this for over 100 years. One of the challenges is, it's one thing to identify kind of the associations. The next is to think about, well, what can be done strategically. And so this is where I think housing is really important. Housing policy, investing in housing, allowing people to stay in homes, for example, that can be that can allow those neighborhoods to stay intact. So, for example, we were just recently, myself, co-author, Dr. Gina South, and we recently published a paper in JAMA Open where we looked at a program in Philadelphia that provides small grants to homeowners to do basic repairs. And we found that crime goes down substantially on blocks when you've made those investments. And part of the mechanism is it allows people to invest in those communities. It holds blocks intact. It keeps them from degrading. And so I think the solutions to serious crime and in particular gun violence are often seen as they are they might be multifaceted, but there are simple things we can do with the right kind of strategic plans, like housing investment, like place-based changes. And that also connects back to one of the strongest correlates or associations with gun violence, which is concentrated poverty, in other words, joblessness. So, if you provide people with jobs, remediating houses, cleaning up vacant lots, people in those communities, that's a jobs program that gives people tangible skill. Some of the money then stays in the community, and it provides people with, Father Greg Boyle's pretty well known in terms of starting Homeboy Industries. He used to say nothing stops a bullet like a job, and I think that we often maybe we overcomplicate the problems here instead of thinking about what are tangible things that we can do. And there's a growing evidence base that these things really do make a difference. Invest in communities, place-based, engaging community groups to do the work, that these things can actually reduce serious crime and violence.
Thank you. And kind of with that, I have a question, and I'll turn it to Aaron. We know that Kansas City has not put, say, as much money into revitalization of neighborhoods like St. Louis, though there are programs in place. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the efforts that are in place in Kansas City and what is needed in the city in addition to financial investments in building up neighborhoods?
Sure. So obviously financial investment and just the availability of capital is huge. But I think kind of tapping into something that Laura said earlier, having some of these difficult conversations and kind of realizing that money isn't going to solve everything. I think that, when we kind of stick to the surface of how we got here and how to address vacancy, there's this thought, and I hear it all the time, right? Like, all we need to do is make the East Side property values more, right? Like, somehow we're going to manipulate the market to make property values in East Kansas City like higher or something. And it just kind of does not address like these root causes of how, the East Side kind of got to where it is and why it keeps being reproduced. But in terms of some of the current efforts, there was a program that was announced by the city a few months ago where they are selling dollar homes. These are land bank homes to nonprofits and other service providers to try to tackle the issue of homelessness. And so these houses are going to be made available through renting to folks who are experiencing homelessness. And so it's kind of a, killing two birds with one stone, I suppose, helping get housing to folks who are the most vulnerable, but also trying to rehab some of these buildings that have been sitting long vacant. I'm also personally involved with the Marlboro Community Land Trust, and Marlboro is in South Kansas City. And so we've been around now for a couple of years, and it took a while to get up and off the ground, but really what we're doing down there is fixing up vacant and abandoned housing. So some of these have been purchased through the Homesteading Authority. We've also purchased some vacant lots, and we're looking to do infill development. And the purpose of a land trust is to keep the housing affordable forever, right? Because you kind of decoupled the housing from the land, and the land will be leased to the folks who buy the home, and the house is available at a much lower price. And so we've had a lot of success down in Marlboro, and there's been conversations of extending the land trust to other neighborhoods and other organizations that have kind of peeped what we're doing down in South Kansas City and want to know how they can get one started in their neighborhood, or how their organization can start one. We've also been in conversation with some municipalities in the metro that are interested in implementing their own versions of a land trust. So it's a way that you can do really local interventions with vacancy and abandoned properties and have them be productive, but also provide affordable housing for folks that may otherwise not be able to afford a house in the market.
Thank you, Erin. And I wish we could keep talking forever. You guys have provided a lot of great insights on this topic, but we are moving to a close. And before we end, I wanted to spend our last few minutes discussing the immediate steps that can be taken to address the housing crisis by those watching. And so tradition, all of our programs, we want to give each of our panelists the opportunity to answer the following questions: so what and now what? And so, Cindy, we'll start with you. What should we do to first to move our communities in the right direction?
Well, I think the economic equity piece has to be implemented. And I don't think you can do anything without repairing some of the damage that has already been done. So I like what John had mentioned, that loan in Philadelphia. It's really a grant up to $25,000. I think we need to do something like that for our residents that have had disinvestment, redlining for decades. But that $25,000 grant to allow them to repair their homes as we start bringing new development and new programs such as Prop NS that helps to stabilize some of the city-owned vacant properties. We want to try to make sure existing residents have an avenue to stay where they are put, where they've lived all of their lives, and invest in their homes. And I think that reparations to repair some of the damage, grants have to be given to some of those residents that live in areas of decline, that have houses that are falling down, that we want to prevent from becoming vacant. We have to make sure that happens, and funding to help those that have been displaced and those that are renting become homeowners in some of those areas. We have a lot of vacant property stock. We can use some of that to also house some of our unhoused residents, some of our homeless population. We need to be looking at a full breadth of ideas as monies and pies are baked to give us resources. We need to look at all of those aspects, but essentially economic equity is important. And I believe that poverty has played a major role. That is really my background in the community action movement. We're fighting to eradicate poverty. But what I've also noticed is if we don't focus on some of the systemic racial issues that exist that prevent us from having economic equity, we will never be able to attain equality or fairness in job placement, in housing, in any of the aspects of living in our nation. And I think we have to focus on that and set aside monies to repair the damage that has been done. Not loans, grants to help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And we're almost out of time, but I wanted to just give each of our panelists, the rest of our panelists, a quick second. So Laura, can you answer those questions? So what and now what?
Very quickly, yeah. So we know that we as a government have caused this concentration of disinvestment and poor property conditions. We know that we've been dealing it with for decades, and we know, especially through this conversation, it's going to take a very long time to undo that and to rebuild a system. And in the meantime, we as a city are spending about $100 per vacant property per year. So at a minimum today, we need to be investing a significant amount of money just simply mowing and boarding and maintaining those 25,000 properties and 2,500 acres that people are living within in the same way that we would mow a lot in the neighborhood of, say, Ladue.
Thank you, Laura. Professor McDonald?
Yeah, I would just echo the idea of strategic investments in housing and vacant lot stabilization. That's, I think, in the short term, the best thing that could be done. And then ideally, through land banks and other community groups, developing housing that's affordable and preferably mixed income and mixed use, so that we can deconcentrate over time poverty. And also provide people with amenities in neighborhoods so they don't have to walk far to get to a grocery store, etc.
And finally, Erin?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Stabilization of vacant properties, something that we've seen in the work that we've been doing is that demolition happens and there's no kind of plan of how to manage that vacant lot, what kind of development is going to be put on it or not. If it's going to remain vacant, there needs to be some kind of maintenance plan before you knock down a building to make sure that the lot is maintained and so it doesn't become an attractor of crime or, other kind of undesirable things. So I would just echo what everybody else has said. It seems like the most tangible, not necessarily easy, but it's something that could be tackled in the very near future.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for helping us to frame violence as a public health issue and for the lively and insightful discussion we had today. I would also like to thank American Public Square at Jewell and the Kansas City Star for facilitating this important discussion and for allowing me to serve today as moderator. Discussions like this help connect our reporting to the community. I would also like to thank Report for America and the Missouri Foundation for Health for supporting these important efforts. The Kansas City Star will continue to investigate the causes, consequences, and possible solutions to the gun violence problem in Missouri. If you want to support the Star's in-depth reporting and solutions-focused community engagement efforts, please visit kansascity.com/MissouriGuns. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe that the conversations that we had are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. APS members help support programs and allow the organization to continue providing a space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits by visiting americanpublicsquare.org. Thank you to everyone who joined today's discussion or provided a question. This conversation will continue in the coming months, and we hope you'll learn from this conversation and feel more empowered to engage in your community as a result. Have a wonderful afternoon.